indentured laborers came to the Caribbean, there were lots of uh, novels and writings that describe this movement as moving beyond the Kalapani. So I'm giving this acknowledgement so that it can be clearly understood. I am not plagiarizing, I am just borrowing the title. So now I'll introduce. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for allowing me to participate in your Baranza series. I trust you will find this presentation informative and interesting. I will also try to share some cultural, geographical, and historical details. And where it's possible, I will give you some personal references from my own family experiences. So first of all, I thought I should begin with this. There were, as I said in the abstract, about 1.5 million indentured laborers. Now, the largest group went to Mauritius. And the screen is nicely divided so that you can see that these went to the west and these stayed in the Eastern Hemisphere. As many of you are from East Africa, I should highlight there that there were 39,000, but these were primarily, they went to the Kenya-Uganda Railway. Much of the people who went to some of the places where this group has originated from came as merchants and traders. But today I wanted to talk mainly about those who came to the Caribbean, and in particular, Guyana, or British Guyana as it was known, and Trinidad, where the bulk of these indentured laborers went to. Some went to Jamaica, but there was not a large amount. But the key point that I want that you have in the back of your mind is that in both Trinidad and Guyana, there is a substantial Indian or South Asian population that exists today. So first of all, the first question I'm asked is, where do these people, where did they come from? Where did they originate? They were mainly from the agricultural and laboring classes. They came from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar in northern India. Just as a religious mix, 85% were Hindus and about 14% Muslims. Now, the British use the term illiterate. I don't particularly like that term because that does not mean to say that they lack intelligence, just some book learning, as they used to call it. So they had never been to big cities like Calcutta, where they boarded, and they mostly spoke a local dialect of Bhojpuri. Before talking much about it, I wanted to describe what I refer to as the Caribbean. Most Canadians, they first think about Jamaica as the Caribbean. And I assume that this is perhaps because of Bob Marley and Usain Bolt. But there are many other parts of the Caribbean that you need to look at. Fortunately, many of you have followed cricket, so you would know about the West Indies cricket team. And I refer to Guyana as being the home of Rohan Kanhai and Alvin Kalicharan. And Trinidad, depending on your age, would be, you know, Sonny Ramadan, Derek Murray, and Brian Lara. If you're into literature, you know about Edgar Bittelholzer from Guyana, or Vidya Naipaul from the Caribbean, from Trinidad. It's a tourist destination, but there's much more to it than just beaches. This may be a little bit confusing, so I thought I'd give some descriptions. Guyana was formerly British Guyana, which was the only English-speaking country in South America. But there's also Dutch Guyana, which is now Suriname, French Guyana, that's part of France. You may know about this from Devil's Island, you know, the penal colony where Papillon went to. But there's also Ciudad Guyana in Venezuela, Guyana Essequiba, the disputed part of Guyana that's really, they claim to be part of Venezuela. For most of the presentation, I'm going to use the term Caribbean, as I think it's more politically correct than West Indies. Similarly, I use the term Indo-Caribbean as a preferred way of describing what they used to call sometimes East Indians, or the derogatory term Coolie, or as they use in Canada, South Asians. Now, Trinidad Tobago, you may see me abbreviating it as TNT, and I thought I'd make it clear that I'm a Trinidadian, and I'm more familiar with Trinidad So I may give more examples from Trinidad, but having lived in Guyana and been married to a Guyanese, I am also aware a little bit about Guyana and the rest of the Caribbean. All of these spellings and words would be used in the presentations. Just to put it in a map, this map, I'm listing what the British territories were like in 1914. This part here is North America, that's Florida you're seeing, and Central America, that goes into Colombia, Venezuela, and Guyana. Now, Guyana, as I said before, is not part of the West Indies, even though the cricket team is called the West Indies cricket team, but that's part of South America. The other mainland country is what was known as British Honduras before, now called Belize. And then there's Trinidad and Tobago. It's a twin island republic. And then there's the other little islands going up. There's Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Martinique, Dominica, Guadeloupe, St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua, and the Virgin Islands. You would see here that these islands around Puerto Rico, it's red because they were British and they were sold to the Americans. And that's part of the US Virgin Islands now. There's Puerto Rico, there's where the Canadian tourists go, the Dominican Republic and Haiti, which together forms the island of Hispaniola. There's Jamaica, and there's Cuba. This here is the Bahamas, and this one here is New Providence, which is where Columbus first landed when he left Spain to go to India. So that's a picture of to give you an indication of where we are in the Caribbean. The two countries I'll be talking about and why I'm referring to their ethnicities, there's Guyana and Trinidad. Trinidad and Tobago really, it's a two-country state. The population in Guyana, even though it's a large country, is not as large as in Trinidad, but the Indo-Caribbean population is roughly about 40%, and in the Indo-Caribbean population in Trinidad and Tobago, it's 35%. Which makes the majority because the Afro-Caribbeans in Guyana are about 30%, and the Afro-Caribbean in Trinidad and Tobago, 34%. There's also mixed ethnicities. There were the descendants of some of the Portuguese laborers who were brought into Guyana and to Trinidad. In Trinidad, you also have a lot of the Syrian Lebanese who came in as traders. There's some French Creoles and some of the others. Guyana is the only one because of they still got a bit of an Amerindian population. There are various Amerindian tribes that still live in the interior. In Trinidad, however, where there were mainly Caribs and Arawaks, they have been virtually wiped out completely, very, very diluted in the society. So I thought I should give you now a detailed map of where they are. First of all, Guyana is in South America. It's 83,000 square miles, so it's a lot bigger than the rest. But the population is just under 800,000. The bulk of the people live in this small area here along the coastlines with Georgetown out to New Amsterdam. The country is divided up by several main rivers, the Essequibo, the Demerara River, the Berbice, and the Corentyne River, which separates Guyana from Suriname. It is possible to go overland. There are bridges across some of the rivers. The Essequibo, which is the largest river, there are no bridges, unfortunately, across that, and you take a ferry to go across to this part of it. Things about Guyana that you may have heard about it already. It's home of the Kaieteur Falls, which is 741 feet. It's the highest single drop waterfall, which is 4 times higher than Niagara Falls. Things that are not so, well, I should say, as I'm coming across here, there's Guyana, Venezuela, and Trinidad, Guyana. Guyana became independent in 1966, and I think the most infamous part about it is Jonestown, where in 1978, about 100,000 people or more drank the Kool-Aid. Trinidad and Tobago, these are 2 islands. Trinidad is the main island, and the smaller part is Tobago. Trinidad is, unlike the rest of the Caribbean, more industrial and not as much as a tourist destination. Tobago is the country that has all the beaches. It's part of Trinidad, but it's not as popular with Canadians because it's further south. It's more expensive than, say, Barbados or St. Lucia, or the more popular destinations of Dominican Republic and Cuba. Fun facts, it's much smaller. It's 1,980 square miles, roughly about 20, 30 miles across and 50 miles north to south. It was discovered in 1492 by Columbus on his third voyage. And one of the early visitors was Sir Walter Raleigh, who visited actually the Pitch Lake, which is located here in La Brea. It is, just for those who may be interested, one of the largest deposits of natural asphalt. It's about 100 acres and about 250 feet deep. The amazing thing about it is that you can walk on it, it's solid, you can drive vehicles on it, but you can dig up the asphalt and the next day it fills back up because the liquid comes back up to the surface. Unfortunately, because it's an oil producing country, the asphalt is not used that much because there's abundance of asphalt you get from the refining of petroleum products. However, in some special instances, like in Germany, they use the lake asphalt for paving the Autobahn, where you need a special surface. Trinidad gained independence in 1962. The unemployment is much lower than in Guyana, it's 2.8%. And you have a natural gas and oil economy, although that's declining a bit. Getting back now to the indentured laborers, now that we've covered the geography and a little bit about the history. The Indians came to the Caribbean primarily because of a lack of opportunities, lack of food, and not being able to satisfy their basic needs. Also, many saw what the British were offering as a chance to improve their lot. And they really didn't understand very much as to where they were going and why, but they were led to believe that they were going to a place where there were high wages, good land, you know, like the promised land type of image was created. And without thinking, they just put their thumbprints on the paper. That's the indentureship agreement. As I pointed out here, some were tricked, persuaded to side, and lied about the length of the journey. They were told that you will get on board the ship and maybe in a few days' time, you'll get to the other side beyond the Kalapani. They were bound under a labor contract for 5 years or more, and they had to serve as laborers on the British sugarcane estates. The grimatia as the corruption of the word agreement. Now, in some cases, just for effect, I will be using some of the vernacular that describes some of the objects and some of the ways that it's said. You may not know some of them because like this one here is a corruption of an English word, but some of the other Indian dialect came from the Bhojpuri, which was not even, it was more of a spoken dialect, and it was corrupted over the years, much like the French and Italian has been corrupted in Canada. In reality, though they were coming to a place where they could establish a new homeland or go back, conditions were much more oppressive than they had been led to believe. Wages were minimal, and many of the terms of the agreement were not honored. Also, abolishing slavery really didn't change the mindset because the plantation owners were still that, their mindset was still that of a slave owner. They were accustomed to coerced labor and just wanted an alternative form of labor. They controlled their workers just like they would have slaves. And the Indian laborers, they were abused, exploited, and very frequently subjected to harsher conditions than what they were contractually permitted. Because my background, I have a bit of a legal background in contracts, my first inclination was to put in the terms of the contract as it existed. But to be honest with you, I tried as hard as I could, that contract was so convoluted and difficult to understand that there was no way that these indentured laborers would understand it, because here am I, in so many years later, still can't understand it. But what I thought I would give is just a bit of the gist. The period of service was for 5 years. You had to work every day except Sundays. You worked for 9 hours a day, Monday to Friday, and 5 hours on Saturdays. And for as far as wages, an adult, I guess, was considered to be over the age of 15. And if you worked for 9 hours, you would get the huge sum of 1 shilling. If you were a female and an adult, that means you're above 15, you would get 9 pence for that 9 hours because they anticipated you would be producing less. Children under 15 also worked, but they got wages in proportion to what they did. In addition to the day work rates, sometimes it was much easier to work by task, or as they call it, ticker work. Whereas you could measure some of these, like the area that you attended to, or the area that you cleaned and removed weeds. So there, they identify that as ticker work or task work. And that was identified as the amount of work that an able-bodied male can do in 6 hours without stopping. So if you did that, and a woman could have done 3/4 of that, you can practice, finish, and go. And the wages were paid on Saturdays. And for a return passage, what you are led to believe that when you are coming is that you will get a return passage. But the contract stated that your passage from India to the Caribbean was paid by the plantations owners. And if you were to leave after completing your first 5 years, you'd have to pay for that. If you wanted it to be free, you had to serve at least 10 years residence in the country. If a worker was under 12 when he came, he'd be entitled to free return passage before he reached 24. If you were born in that country and you reached 12 and your parents were going back, you could go ahead back with them. Now, recognizing that you couldn't find ways to feed yourself during the initial period, you couldn't find your supermarkets, I guess. So for the first 6 months, you got your, for the cost of 4 pence per day, you would get rations for each person 12 years and up. If you were a child, 5 to 12, you receive half the rations for free. And if you were under 5, you got 9 chataks of milk. I don't know what a chatak is, so please don't ask me what that is. But after your arrival, that's what you would get. You also got housing, free of rent. When you were ill, you had a medical plan. You could get medical attendance and medicine. And if you had a wife who was still living, you were not allowed to marry another wife. But if you were married to more than one wife in your country, and when you came to the Caribbean, you could take them with you, and you would have legally registered and acknowledged as his wife. I'll talk a little bit now about how they were brought from India to the Caribbean. The first ship went to Guyana, which was the Whitby, and it sailed from the port of Calcutta in January of 1838 and arrived in May 1938. That's almost 5 months it took. The first ship to Trinidad, the Fat al Razak, came on May 30th, 1845 and brought 225 indentured laborers. 3 died en route. Just to cut it, there were 534 voyages between India and Guyana and 315 voyages to Trinidad. The last ship that came to Trinidad arrived on April 22nd, 1917, bringing 421 indentured laborers. That's when slavery was abolished. I just put this in as a point of interest. The last ship that went to Guyana was the sailing ship SS Resurgent. But in 1955, there was concern from some of these children and descendants of indentured laborers, that they never got an opportunity to accept their return arrangement. So to help in politics in 1955, they chartered that last ship, which at that time became the motor vessel, we say, because they scrapped the sails and put in diesel engines, and they chartered it, and 258 Guyanese returned to India, many of them just for the purpose of returning to the homeland to die. The journey that they took them from India along the coast of South Africa and back to the Caribbean. Ships like this was the one that first went to Trinidad, the Fatal Razak. They were sail ships. What I thought I'd just include, just to give you an idea, we do have copies of the ship's manifest for the Fatal Razak. So I thought that I'd throw that in. You can't read it, but I'll give you some examples of when they were. And this is the last register of where indentured laborers were assigned to what estates. Conditions on board these ships were cramped and depressing, almost similar to the slave ships. The journey took long, 10 to 20 weeks. There were outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, dysentery, measles. And a lot of people got sick and many died. They averaged about 17% on some journeys. Even when they disembarked, further deaths occurred just to acclimatize into the colonies. On board the ship, you were given rice and dal, and other sparse provisions were carried for the entire ship. And each ship was provided with a dolak and some musical instruments because you have to upkeep the spirits of the indentured laborers. Don't know how much rice and dal you could have eaten because sometimes these ships encountered bad weather and took a long time. I just thought, to give you an example, I just arbitrarily picked a few ships. And these were ships arriving into Trinidad in 1852. But what I wanted to show, like these ships, like this through Britain brought 289 people, 6 died, 293, 27 died, 183, 3 died, 290, 11 died. There was a fair amount of deaths along the journey. And these ships were sailing for a long time. And I wanted in particular to show off that whereas like this is 344 came, 14 died. But on July 2nd, 1858, the Salset came in and had 197 indentured laborers because 106 died en route. Looking at the date, I would assume that they may have encountered some bad weather as well because hurricane season starts off like in June, July. And the other point of interest on that Salset is that my great-grandfather, Rajbali, was on that ship, the Salset. What happened, because of the intense experience, you're going through that voyage, encountering bad weather, eating the same foods, being sick, and they formed very strong, lifelong bonds of, as we call it, the Jahaji Bai and Jahaji Bahin. The solidarity became the basis of a community in the New World, often transcending caste and religious distinctions. You didn't really care what caste the person was because they were your Jahaji Bai. This is one of the issues that, for those who read about indentured immigration, initially 10% of the people brought were women, and eventually when they realized the issues that were being created, they came up to about 40%. This gender imbalance created other problems but empowered women. And point of interest, until 1845, neither Hindu nor Muslim marriages were given legal standing. What you got at the time was your indentureship arrangement, and when you finished, you had a free paper. Processing. When you arrived, the ships docked at an island outside of the harbor where they could be quarantined for a while. In Trinidad, it was known as Nelson Island. And to further indignities, I thought, they washed and bathed them with this Indian bath soap, which I remember because it was a very foul smelling, uh, with a carbolic disinfectant derived from coal tar. This also helped because the people had infectious diseases, they had skin diseases, so it really did help to clean them up. Names were recorded, no such luxury as having two names, one was sufficient, spelling was unimportant, and they were assigned to your estate. Now, when you were given the names, some of the Hindus discovered that they could acquire a complimentary caste upgrade by providing a false names. All you said was Miranam Maharaj, and you were elevated to a Brahmin. So here they are, after they were washed and put on clean clothes and looking pretty, they are now ready to go to the estates. So this is on Nelson Island in Trinidad, and there are a few of the immigrants. Indentureship, according to the colonists, the British magazine, said when it ended, it had nothing really to do with humanitarian concerns. It was strictly because of declining profitability. But as I pointed out when I talked to people about indentureship, despite this being marginally better than slavery, the descendants of the indentured laborers bore no really major hatred towards the British and just moved on with their lives, the development in their new country. What did they do? They worked on the sugarcane field planting, taking care of the crop, cutting, transporting it to the factory. In Guyana, they use punts along the trenches because they use waterways. In Trinidad, they use cart-drawn vehicles. And when the crop was finished, they assisted in processing and bagging the brown sugar. So when that's all finished, you start all over again, day in, day out, but like any other plantations, and wait for the 10 years for your food paper. If you ask what they did, the men, they cut cane. What did the women do? The women cut cane. And when you didn't cut cane, well, you had some free time, you could sit around, get your hookah and some musical instruments and sing and amuse yourself in the luxury of your clubhouse, or whatever it's called. Now, I brought this up again, even though I talked about it a little bit, because on completion of your 5 years, while you were allowed to leave, you had to pay for repatriation, which was around £15. Now, if you're working for a shilling a day and saving some money, you couldn't save £15 in 2 or 3 years' time. So most elected to serve another 5 years because they had nowhere else to go. Additionally, some went back, and then as word got back, when they got to India, they were ostracized because their communities were no longer there. People who they met said, "You're slaves," and they couldn't really be accepted in the community. So what they did was turn around and signed up to come back for another term. So recognizing that, the government of Trinidad offered indentured laborers an inducement to settle when the contract expired. So if they decided to forfeit that right to return, they were given £10, which was a lot of money. So with that money, they could buy some land or do something to better their lives. In 1873, they changed it because the option for land was becoming more and more, everyone was requesting this. So they gave you 5 acres of land and £5 cash. Now, the British only gave you lands that was of very little value for planting sugarcane, and the Grand Plan was invariably steep and mountainous or part of a swamp. The resourceful Indians who got this useless property soon discovered they could plant cocoa, coffee in the mountains and rice in the swamps. As I tell people, my paternal ancestors were cocoa and coffee, and my maternal side rice. Now, during the indentured leadership, workers were denied many freedoms, including learning new skills, getting formal education. So because of this, once they were liberated, they worked really hard at building up family units and looking forward to getting property and education. to this day, in all Indian communities, this is still the motivating driving force. And they were relatively successful in acquisition of property and the family ties, but they were limited schools. So it wasn't until 1868 when the Canadian mission was conceptualized. This is when missionaries from Canada came to the Caribbean. They came to Trinidad mainly. And in the rural areas, they started building schools. The Canadian missionaries were from the Presbyterian Church. And essentially in Canada, what happened when the Presbyterian and the Methodists, and they all merged into the United Church. So in Trinidad, they refer to it as the Canadian mission. Schools were an essential part of spreading religion. They went into rural areas and the community benefited. So many of them converted from Hinduism or Islam and became Christians in the Presbyterian Church. They adopted English names and began to enjoy a more purposeful and cultured lifestyle. The Canadian missions not only spread the word of God, but some of them got into trade and industry. I met one of the descendants of one of these immigrants many years who was there, and he said, my ancestors went to Trinidad to do good, and they did very well. The lifestyles, a female missionary who I should not name, criticized the morality of these coolie women because they would leave their husbands and go to another man, and it was mainly because of opportunity. They didn't have to put up with anything that the husband afforded. Why did they? Because there were more men than women, so they had less dependency and they could independently think. I always claim that women's rights may have emerged because of this imbalance in gender, and Trinidad may have seen women's liberation much earlier before it became fashionable in North America. Now, as part of the schooling, students who had learned sufficiently from the missionaries could start sharing their knowledge to new students. And they became a pupil teacher. I know my father was one of those, where after you attained a certain level, you became a pupil teacher, and you can spread education. And at the same time, what the Canadian mission did, they will then send their teachers, their pupil teachers, to training college where they could be trained to become teachers. In the case of my father, when he was a pupil teacher, when his turn came up to go to training college, he was then told that he would have to become a Christian. And he decided at that time he'd rather not do that. So he quit being a teacher and became a tailor's apprentice instead. Secondary schools and a theological college were established, and many of the Indian people in Trinidad owe their education to the Canadian mission's 72 elementary schools and 5 high schools that were eventually established. As I said, my family benefited from this. I went to elementary school from the Canadian mission, and to this day, irrespective of what your religion is, we still maintain connection with the people who were there trained by the Canadian missions. I thought I'd talk a little bit about Islam in the Caribbean. There were some Muslims that were brought in, but they were spread around in many estates, so getting together was very difficult. Some couples and families came and they formed a nucleus of an informal Jamaat, so they could get together for Salat at the local, where they created makeshift masjids. But it wasn't by 1893 when they became a little bit better organized. And soon they observed that they could replicate the Canadian mission strategies towards bringing in missionaries to help stem the flow of Muslims converting to Christianity. And as a point of interest, they contacted the Muslim League, and a missionary was sent from India. And at that time, they had expected someone schooled in the Hanifa tradition, but instead They got an Ahmadi. So what happened, the student that they sent from Trinidad to Lahore came back with the same type of Islam. But early Islam, out of necessity, integration of culture was common. On account of literacy and bonding on ships, culture was mixed, like in East Africa and several other places, where religion had absorbed a fair amount of culture, and the principles of religion took second place. Additionally, the way they were recorded, frequently only they were listed as Mohammedan, and find it difficult to find other Muslims. Very few could read the Quran in Arabic, and so they couldn't share any of its messages. Up until the 50s, I remember the khutbahs were invariably in Urdu, which no one spoke. There was no formal organization, so ad hoc groupings of Islam was determined mainly by the theological practices from the communities. There was a slight dominance by Sunnis, but there was also a Shia enclave in the west of the city of Port-of-Spain. And there were three areas where, because of these missionaries, there were Ahmadis. Many communities, after the termination of indentureship, brought in their own missionaries to help teach the youth. So while Islam may be practiced more in Guyana, I'm more familiar with organization and history in Trinidad, and my focus has been more on Trinidad. I know in our local Jamaat, my father was one of the more liberal ones, and in 1940 they brought a Palestinian scholar to educate the community. I heard about this because I was told, like, on his return in 1944 when he was going back, he came to our house to say goodbye, and there was a new baby. The guy's name was Tahir Ali, and that's how I got my name. Just very briefly to show it in the chart, the population of Hindus is about 18%, and Islam's just about 5%. Still, the dominant population is Catholics, and these are the Protestants. But a fair amount of the Protestants were Presbyterians from the Canadian Mission Group. I talked a little bit about Islam, but by bringing in various missionaries, it is my view and my personal view of this, that the communities were not really well served because a lot of baggage was brought in by these so-called missionaries, and they created more division because Trinidad had enjoyed a mixed community where everyone participated in each functions. There was no real separation of different sects. Culture was more important and rich because of the diversity of people brought in by the British. There was the Spanish, French, labor was also important from Ireland. And after the slavery was abolished, Portuguese came in from Madeira, and they were familiar with planting sugarcane, but they couldn't stand the weather and eventually ran our shops. So all the shopkeepers were Madeirans. There was also a lot of mixing and intermarriages, which created that mixed community. Trinidad is world famous for its carnival, invention of the steel band music, which you hear about, calypso, and the annual festival, which culminates on Ash Wednesday, has also infiltrated into Indian music because you have chutney soca, which is an Indian version of calypso music. It has even gone into what we call Jose. Now, with all due deference to the communities who celebrate the Ashura, it's a solemn occasion, and it is in Trinidad as well, but on the 10th day of Muharram, they parade the streets with colorful tajas because this tradition was practiced in the communities in India from which they came. And at that time, they beat drums and tassas, as we call it, and that has led to greater participation by all races and religions because they participate in everything. Diwali is practiced, it's a public holiday. Thanks to Bollywood and early Indian movies, Indian music is quite common, and this may have improved some of the Hindi language skills. But most of the dialect that's spoken is the Bhojpuri dialect, and it's used in the chutney soka. Now, when we talk about culture, I can't help but bring in the food, because it's because of my interest in food I learned about culture. But Caribbean food has benefited because of the mixture of the different cultures. Uh, initially they were fed mainly rice and dal, but they wanted some other vegetables, and out of necessity, we have the term tarkaris, which were developed because in Trinidad you could curry almost everything to make it taste better. As agricultural workers, they may have brought some seeds with them for like chilies and some fruits, which they planted around their jupas, which is what the mud huts were called in Trinidad, or logis as they were called in Guyana. And they found just wild growing weeds. There's one that the French patois called chardon benet, which they called bandania because it had a taste and smell like coriander. So there's also other kinds of buns, because the little fruit, they got bun karila, they got turmeric, and suddenly food got taste. You Trinidadians curry mangoes, squashes. There's a special fruit which we call by the French name châtaigne, or in Guyana it's called Tahir. It's the size of a breadfruit, but it's spiky and little things like a jackfruit. And it has a chestnut-like thing. The British call it bread nut. So that makes the best curry. We use the Gujarati word of bhajis, and you get all kinds of bhajis there. For meat, they got the small bony fish that lives in muddy waters. In Trinidad, it's known as cascadoo, the patois word, or in Guyana, it's hassa, that makes great curries. Guyanese Indian food is a little bit more basic because Trinidad has more variety and fusion. Trinidad was, you may have seen the roti, which is the original wrap. For weddings or dinners, they cook these large, men do the cooking in these large pots. And I often looked at the industrialization of Trinidad and felt that because men were cooking, they found ways, because in the refinery, whenever you had scrap metals, you would make a steel tower. But as the men were cooking, they would cook the curries, but not the rotis. And they felt soon that they could cook the rotis, but make it in a bigger way. So seeing they were making towers, they used the full width of a steel sheet. So they made a 48-inch tower, and you could make a huge paratha roti, which we call bus-up shot. So those of you in the GTA will know about the bus-up shot, the wrap roti, or the doubles, and you probably figured it doesn't taste anything like South Asian cooking. It's different because there are different ingredients, different cooking techniques, and it's also universal with everyone in the Caribbean eats these foods, because we also have African dishes. We cook the fufu and metem, which is something like your kukupaka. We have lots of Middle Eastern foods because of the Syrians. But I always refer to the kalaloo, which is made from the taro leaves, the dashing leaves, okros, coconut milk, hot peppers, and some meats, so seafood, normally crabs, because this represents the culture. It's a mixture of everything blended for an improvement over the individual ingredients. While the Caribbean was originally agricultural, many industries developed. Jamaica and Guyana were amongst the largest exporters of bauxite for making aluminum. Trinidad is one of the earliest producers of petroleum, which started in 1911. Trinidad was one of the major suppliers of petroleum products during the First World War. As an oil producer, Trinidad is the richest island in the Caribbean with an industrial development. Not only it produces oil and gas, but a lot of skilled technicians, skilled trades and professions, and downstream industries. Although there's a downturn of oil in Trinidad at present, it's picking up in Guyana, because as you may know, the region of Venezuela, Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname has the largest known reserves of oil in the world. Mindful that oil has a limited lifespan, Trinidad, willing and knowingly, embarked on a program where they would utilize, uh, one more, where they utilize their oil, gas, and wealth to create industries for future employment. Because of its ammonia plants, they were the largest exporter of ammonia and urea for fertilizers. Trinidad also had steel electric arc furnace for reducing iron for their steel fabrication. They played toyed around with the exportation of LNG, and a huge industrial complex was developed using their natural gas and a harbor. Unfortunately, when you're trying to be a developing country and you're progressing, uh, you need markets. And when you depended on the US markets, and they were also in competition with US companies, the US simply refused to buy the products. And that created part of the problems in the marketing of the development of further industries. In terms of politics, I'm running out of time now, so I'm going to talk a little faster. Trinidad had all the British colonies, the divide and conquer. And there are two major political parties, both in Guyana and in Trinidad. I can't say that they have set ideologies because regrettably, the voting is divided basically by race because the urban areas are predominantly Black and the rural areas Indian. So with the population almost split equally, so too are the votes. And because of the way the constituencies are developed, the African Party normally wins. Since independence, Guyana has about 2 terms, Trinidad has 2 terms of Indian Party and Guyana 4 terms. Just you could see this because with your population being almost equally divided, if you get half of the population, you depend on some of the other people outside, and that has infiltrated. And so the 1%ers who exist in almost every community can influence what happens. I thought I'd very briefly say in 2020 there were elections, not only in the US, but there was also in Trinidad and Guyana. In Trinidad, it was a 58% turnout, in Guyana 70%. The ruling party in Trinidad won 49% of the votes, and the other party won 47% of the vote. One got 22 out of 41 seats, the other got 19 out of 41 seats. In Guyana, there was a bit of a discrepancy, or there were concerns, but eventually it was finally resolved. And the one party got 50%, which is led by Irfan Ali, the current president of Guyana. And the former president of Guyana, who was David Granger, he got 47% of the votes, getting 33 seats before, and now getting 81 of the 65 seats. Famous politicians in Trinidad, Uriah Butler, but ones you may have heard about is like Eric Williams. And to show that the participation of Indo-Caribbeans, Basdeo Panday was the first Indian prime minister. Kamla Prasad Bisesa was the first female prime minister in Trinidad. In Trinidad, the highest elected position is the prime minister, but Trinidad has a president as head of state. And from 1887 to 1997, Nur Hassan Ali was the president. He was the first Muslim head of state in the Western Hemisphere and was the only person in Trinidad to be appointed by each party appointed him for a 5-year term. Guyana, politics are a little bit more awkward, and but I really have to simplify this. They elected Cheddi Jagan as prime minister in 1957, and I'm going to go fast forward for this. In 1961, he was overturned, and the British, with the help of British and the CIA, because they were afraid that the foreign assets in their industries will be jeopardized. But after some turbulent times, there were some riots and mass immigration of Indo-Caribbean population. That's where about 35,000 people came to live in the Scarborough area. Even though they replaced Cheddi Jagan with Forbes Burnham, who served from 1964 to 1985. Under his term, all the companies that they were worried about, the bauxite companies, were nationalized. And Burnham established ties with Russia and Cuba, and Guyana became an impoverished country. Its currency, which was equivalent to the Trinidad currency, devalued. I know the Trinidad currency today is worth like about, you get 530 roughly Trinidadian dollars for the Canadian dollar, whereas the Guyanese currency is $167 Guyanese to one Canadian dollar. And they were both equal at one time. In 1992, under the supervision of Jimmy Carter, Chelly Jagan was again returned to power. But after his death, there was some uncertainty and there were several changes in governments. Briefly, just talking a little bit about higher education, there's very high literacy rates, 99% in Trinidad and 97% in Guyana. In Trinidad and Guyana, they're high and they produce world-class intellectuals. In the higher education, the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture was established in 1921 and was amongst the leaders in the field. University of the West Indies, they've got it in 4 different countries, Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and Antigua. And that serves the English-speaking Caribbean. Guyana started the University of Guyana in 1963, and Trinidad and Tobago, the University of TT. All education in Trinidad and Tobago has been completely free for many years. So there's a second diaspora, which I refer to, where descendants of the indentured laborers from the Caribbean can be seen today in many countries. Like other British colonies, they went to the UK, later they went to the USA, and they followed later in Canada. In the GTA, the Guyanese came in 1962, and immigrants from TNT were generally those from students who had studied here and remained, but there were some who came through migration in that period in 1970 and again in 1987. So this is why you could see some familiar faces like on CBC, you could see Ian Hanuman Singh, several of the weather reporters, and other Trinidadian faces. I thought I would talk a little bit more and show you some Trinidadian faces. And the first person I had thought about was, if my audience was much younger, I would have talked about Nicki Minaj, because Nicki Minaj, who is the rap hip hop singer, her real name was Oniki Maraj. And it's conveniently because her father got killed in a road accident a couple of days ago, actually. But in this audience, I thought I would give you some examples of well-known Trinidadian people. And as there's more of a women community, I thought I would feature the former First Lady of Trinidad and Tobago. This is Zalia Hassan Ali. And the person on the side here in the, I guess it's purple or blue, that's the former Prime Minister, Kamla Prasad Bisesa. So I've gone over my time, but I thank you for allowing me to present, and I'm open for some questions. Sorry I had to rush through part of it because I had far more material than I had time.
That's great. That's amazing. You covered a lot of ground. Tahir, if you can stop sharing your screen, then wonderful, excellent. Okay, we're ready for questions. I don't see anything in the chat. There's a comment, the Indian diaspora is scattered in Africa, West Indies, UK, etc. And each think of themselves as a different Indian, some more Indian than other. What's your comments on that, Tahir? You're checking the chats, right?
Indian is scattered in Africa, West Indies, UK. I wish I could answer it. Unfortunately,
You can't hear Naz.
You,
Oh,
can you
am I muted? No.
go ahead?
Okay, sorry. Um, Now I don't know how to answer your question because you know it's the cultural aspects and the once the communities met under different conditions and in different political environments, uh, they adapted to different communities. Uh, some of them consider themselves more like I guess more East African than Indian. Some consider themselves more Indo. That's why I use the term Indo-Caribbean. So I really can't really give you a definitive answer as to whether they consider themselves to be more Indian than the others. I can't see how we could be considered in the Caribbean as being more Indian than people from India, because in the general scheme of things, we are not really Indian. We are second diaspora. So we were Caribbean first. This is why like in my case, I describe myself as Indo-Caribbean Canadian, with the last hyphen coming first. I'm Canadian before I am Caribbean, and I'm Caribbean before I'm Indian. Sorry, that's the best I could do.
Right. Traveling to TNT and Guyana.
Good itinerary. As I explained, first of all, it's not as easy to get to Trinidad as it is with packages like you can get to Jamaica or you can get to Cuba, but it's easy to get there because of direct flights. There's the Caribbean Airlines, which is owned by the government of Trinidad and Tobago, and they have daily flights to Trinidad, and they also go on to Guyana as well. So there are flights there. They're excellent hotels. Unfortunately, because most of the visitors and most of the travel to Trinidad in particular has been for business. So they're more expensive than, say, beach hotels. In Tobago, there are beach hotels, but again, because of the distance of travel and cost, they're more patronized by Germans and the Brits more than Canadians. I can answer that question about in East Africa.
Go ahead.
Yes, the railway. The indentured system in East Africa, I think, because very few went on, as I showed you in that slide, to build the railway from Mombasa to Uganda. And most of the East Indians, the Indian population in East Africa, as far as I understand, were people who went as traders or merchants for commerce. Those that went to the Kenya-Uganda Railway, as far as I'm aware, they did have very much the same sort of conditions, but they were there for a specific purpose and building the railway. And the circumstances were a lot different, as I understand. A high percentage of them got killed by wild animals. So that was the disincentive. Rather than just being abused by the British, you could be eaten by a lion. So I'm not sure what was the differences there. Oh, someone filmed Jose.
Yeah, Shirley Tower, he is a television program producer.
Yeah,
He used to do travel shows. He says he's retired, but he's still kind of in the industry. And yeah, so that's from him.
I tried to acknowledge this when I talked about it. I am fully aware it's a solemn occasion, but I'm also stating that because of the community culture, there's participation by everyone. And the attraction that Jose had was not so much the religious aspect, but the parading on the streets and beating of the tassa and the drums. And that was seen to the community as more of a celebratory thing. And this is why you'd find that people who are non-Muslims participating, which is maybe not necessarily a bad thing, but yes, there is incidents of drinking. I knew, for example, when Eid al-Adha became a holiday, and Eid al-Fitr was also a holiday at one time, they used to advertise Eid fetes, meaning there were big parties for Eid. And because they promoted that Eid was more of a religious celebration, uh, so too is Christmas, eh? And Christmas is celebrated with just as much alcohol as everything else. But the Caribbean people are fans of dance and music. So we're party people.
Great. Tahir, tourism, how big is the tourism industry in TNT and Guyana?
In Guyana, it's not very much. There is a bit of ecotourism that's happening in Guyana. Trinidad has tourism for Carnival because it's world famous. It's the largest, it's even larger than Rio and New Orleans, the Mardi Gras there. But it is a festival. You know, it's known, sure, some people only see the partying and the dancing and the drinking, but there's lots of creativity. The ability to make costumes and floats requires a lot of skill. And arising out of that, there is a lot of different arts which came up that supports carnival and culture. Similarly, the music, it's people who are developing musical instruments out of oil drums, and the creativity. It's been noted as one of the leading or the most recent musical instrument to be developed, the only one that was developed in the 20th century. Everything else predates that. And it was a case of developing a form of, it started off with some of the Jose beating on the drums, because the British make it illegal to have drums because they felt that it would incite riots. So in 1894, there was a huge Jose riots, which banned the use of drums. Similarly, when the steel band was developed, it was because there was no way of celebrating in 1917 and 1918 when the slavery was finished. So they just gathered drums and oil cans and garbage bins and beat this to make some music to parade through the streets. So yes, it is a festival.
Right.
I don't know if I've answered your question,
Yeah.
Shirali.
One other point, what's the best time to travel to TNT and uh, apart from the carnival time or Guyana, ecotourism?
Well, Trinidad has two distinct, both the Caribbean, both Guyana and Trinidad, distinct seasons. One season is wet and the other season is dry. In the dry season, it could get very, very dry. And while it's a good time because you got good clear days, all the beautiful scenery, some of the trees start drying. But we usually like to go, because we live in Canada, we go in the winter months. So we find January the best time to go. But if you want to see the true beauty of the country, maybe in late August, early September, where the rains has subsided a little bit, it's getting a little bit cooler. Like December, it's much more comfortable, and as well as December, January, than if you go in the peak of the summertime. So yes, there is, depending on your interest, but you don't have to worry too much about climate, because traveling around, even though it's raining, it doesn't rain 24 hours nonstop. It rains for a short while and then the sun comes out again. So any time is really good. It depends on what time you want to. There is an issue of affordability. because in the wintertime, especially in February, when the carnival is there, prices are about double or triple.
Right, right, right. Temperatures kind of similar throughout the year?
Temperature, yeah, as a matter of fact, I joke about it. You get up and say, what's the weather today? And you see there's a high of 30 and a low of 25. But the lowest temperature it gets, it's, I think this year they had some unusually cold weather when the temperature actually dropped below 20. It was like 19 degrees. But you also had some, because of climate change, I guess, had 34 degrees heat, which you never had before.
Right, right. Yeah.
I'm looking through the questions to see if there's anything else.
Economic.
Thank you very kindly, Rihanna.
The last one, economic disparities.
I'm not sure what Murtaza.
No, he's just saying that he's part of the group. But what are the economic disparities between various ethnic groups in these countries?
Okay. You know, in addressing that question, there are two issues. One is urban versus rural. And then culture comes in as well. There are cultural aspects because there's a traditional, an inherent trait of Indians all over. They always think about tomorrow, put aside some money to make sure that you have money for the future. So there is a more frugality there. Whereas with some of the people of African origin, and it's great for the economy of the country because if you spend, you develop other sources. As a matter of fact, the merchants who sell products are happy because one ethnic group spends more than the other. It's a question of values and what's important. Both parties, both ethnic groups, the main ones, of course, have similar values, but there is more of a value of education and savings and opening businesses and so on by people of Indian origin. And the people of African origin, because they're urban, and if the opportunities are there, they get all the jobs in the government, the civil servants, they work on as the stevedores on the terminals, on the ships. And whereas the Indian were the ones who were more in agriculture.
Right.
Also, the merchants, you know, the people of Syrian Lebanese groups, when they came, they didn't come, they were one of the few groups that didn't come as sugarcane laborers. The Portuguese also came as sugarcane laborers, but the Syrian Lebanese came after the conflicts in Syria when Lebanon was formed and they had their problems then. Several left and went to Argentina and Venezuela, and a lot came to Trinidad. And they then were able to start off as merchants, selling and fabrics for making clothing, and then getting into curtains and getting into electrical appliances and other types of commodities and automobiles and regrettably even to drugs. So they were more diversified, and they are the primary owners of some of the big businesses now.
Right, right.
Also, the wealthiest people, as a matter of fact, if you look at the wealthiest person in Trinidad is allegedly a woman of Indian origin who runs one of the largest steel fabricating companies.
Right. Okay, we'll take maybe a couple more questions and then we'll let everyone sort of head off to the other session they want to join. Any other questions? Tahir,
Yeah.
final comments. You know so much about the country you come from. Now, is this out of your personal interest? Uh, yes, I understand your interest in culture and food and all that, but this is much more than that. You've done your own autobiography or some book or something, right?
Yeah, but I, you know, it all stems from the fact that, like other people of Indian origin, when you're thinking of going to university, the professions that you hear about are the typical doctor, engineer, lawyer, accountant, in that order. Um, I always say I became an engineer with my first degree, not because I intended it to be, because it was easy to do and that's why I did it. My greater interest, when I started university, I started in arts and sciences, and I had preferred the literature and poetry and history and psychology and philosophy, but I couldn't pass the exams. So I went there and I enjoyed it, but I couldn't get good marks in it because you had to do some work. Whereas in the engineering, you just do some mathematics and you solve some equations and problems, and that was it. You didn't have to study. So I spent my time, and I went to night school doing the humanities when I was doing engineering. Fortunately, too, at the time I came out, you could get a job much easier as an engineer than you could get as a job as a writer or a poet or a journalist or something. But I didn't like, I don't like, I'm a loner. But because of my interest, and I make no apologies, my favorite pastime is cooking. And my interest in food has stimulated my interest in culture. Like I make no apologies about that either. My interest in religion came about because of architecture. And I made a study of Islamic architecture because there are some fascinating ones. I went all over the world primarily just to see some of these Islamic architectures, not only in recent times, but from way back,
Yeah.
And because of that, I got interested in religion a bit. Yeah.
So there you go. There's number one. The next one will be on food, and after that will be the Islamic architecture.
No, I don't do I'll do the architecture, but not the religion part. Yeah.
This has been fascinating. Uh, Marvelous, excellent presentation, and you obviously spent time to prepare a professional presentation, which obviously we very much appreciate. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry I had to rush through some of it
No,
because
that's
I was mindful of the time, but I also felt that if I spoke longer, there would be few hard questions to answer.
no. I'm sure it wasn't that. A couple of things. My viewers, participants who are so loyal to us and who join us on a weekly basis, thank you for your support, but I need some help. Please do suggest any other speakers or give me contacts, and we can get good talent like Tahir, who can come and inform us, educate us, give us something to think about, ponder over. So please get in touch with me, reply to my email or on the WhatsApp, and I'll certainly follow up on that. Next week, okay, earlier time, of 2 o'clock. We are getting a top-notch dental practitioner here from Toronto, and he will bust the myths about your mouth and how to take care of your teeth, especially for us seniors. Same time, 2 o'clock. Take care, be safe, and if you're offered that vaccine, do take it. It'll help. All the best. See you next week. Bye-bye.